Welcome to Intro to Luke. In today's video, we're in Luke chapter 5, verse 17 through 26. This is part 2. In part 1, we looked at the literary aspects of this passage, while in this video, we're looking at the theological aspects. So let's begin with a quick overview of the passage. Jesus is teaching. The scribes and Pharisees from all around Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem have come to check out, to see what this miracle worker is doing. Luke tells us something very important in verse 17 when he says that the power of the Lord was there with Jesus to heal. Then we learn about the paralyzed man, who fortunately for him had friends who loved him and literally picked up his bed and brought him to Jesus. But when they got there, there were so many people they couldn't even get in. But they were persistent. And they went up to the roof, removed the roofing materials, and dropped this man down into the midst of the crowd, literally in front of Jesus. Luke records in verse 20 that Jesus recognizes their faith. But then he says, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." And this creates a firestorm. Verse 21 records that these scribes and Pharisees, they're thinking, who is this who blasphemes? Who alone but God can forgive sins? Now, we've seen that the power of the Lord to heal was there. We've seen the persistent faith of the friends. And we've seen that Jesus recognizes their faith. And yet, Luke records Jesus as pitching us a curveball, breaking right over the plate. They don't see it coming, and neither do we. Jesus says, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." All of us were expecting him to say something like, "You're healed, rise and walk," or some other fancy words of healing, but no, that is not what happens. This is so startling that it is effective. Everybody's startled. Jesus knows his little congregation. He knows who's there. And so this is important when you start to think about what he's doing. He's aiming at these scribes and Pharisees. As we saw in the last video, this was the first encounter that Luke records for Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees. And what's happening here is we're starting to see that as the chapters go on, that they are fussing about things like, disciples pulling grain and eating it on the Sabbath day, or Jesus not doing the ceremonial washings that they believed you should do, or healing on the Sabbath. Things like, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day? These religious questions were certainly important to them, but Luke is putting it on steroids here in chapter 5. This is the most important religious discussion. Is Jesus God? Now, interestingly, Jesus turns their logic from verse 21 on its head. He decides, right, I'm going to heal this man. But that puts me in a quandary. I'm going through the thinking of Jesus. That's above my pay grade, but this is the idea. He's in the quandary. He can say, your sins are forgiven you, but really only God knows if your sins are forgiven, right? So he needs a witness, a testimony, some form of authentication. And that's where the healing actually comes in. So I want you to think about that. That is important. And we're going to see this again in chapter 7. When John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus to ask, are you the one, or should we expect another? Jesus answers, says, tell John what you see and hear. The blind see, the deaf hear, the lame leap, the dead rise. These are signs of authentication. In other words, telling John, yes, I am the one. And so now we start to see something quite interesting. Jesus deals with them in a very effective way. He says in verse, and he really sets the table well. Let's just say it that way. in verses 23 and 24, because he says to them, which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or rise and walk? But to show you that the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins here on earth, he turns to the man and says, rise. Okay, I want to just stop right there. So, you know the story. Of course, the man's going to be healed. Now, this is very important because what he's doing is setting this table, as I said, for establishing his claim of being God. Because remember, he's turning their logic on its head in verse 21. If he can show that he is forgiving sins, then he must be God. In other words, look at it this way. No healing, no forgiveness of sins, Jesus isn't God. It's very important. You have to look at it that way. So what's going to happen here is, of course, Jesus is no riverboat gambler. He knows he can do this. So what he does, of course, is he's shown, and it really kind of gets my head in a crazy place when I think about this passage, which is easier to say. Because I tend to think, as a modern empirical thinker, that salvation is over here, and forgiveness of sins and salvation, healing of the body is over here. It allows me to live a better life in this life. It's also a sign of the coming kingdom. But I kind of see these, as separate, and yet Jesus brings them together, essentially making them two sides of the same coin. And this is necessary because the healing is a sign of authentication. Very important. So what does Jesus do? Without any formalities, with no nice words of healing, he just points to the man and says, rise up, take up your bed, and go home. And Luke records, immediately the man got up. He takes up his bed and he starts glorifying God, which is what everybody should do, right? Absolutely. All right. So what Jesus has done is he has linked the healing with the forgiveness of sins. They go together, hand in glove. And this is Jesus' way of saying to them, I am God. I'm the living God. Now remember, this is all occurring in chapter 5, which is at the beginning of Jesus' Galilean ministry. Very important. It's establishing a baseline for how these scribes and Pharisees should respond. Oh, Jesus is God, therefore I must respond appropriately, right? But that's not how the story is going to work its way out. No, it's not going to work that way. Remember that the gospel always demands a response from us. And now, at the very outside of his ministry, outset of his ministry, Jesus establishes his divinity. And since the gospel demands a response, when we hear the words of Jesus, we must respond appropriately, or nothing good will come from it. And with that, I'll see you next time.